Welcome, Shannon Watts, to our latest How conversation. It's just wonderful to have you. Shannon has become a friend. Shannon is somebody I consider to be not only a special person, but a remarkable leader who's forged a unique path that is not only admirable, but one that inspires and one from which we can learn so much. So, welcome, Shannon.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here.
And for a more formal introduction, so everybody really understands your track record and your quote unquote bio, Shannon is the founder of Moms Demand Action, the nation's largest grassroots group fighting against gun violence. And Shannon has spent more than a decade leading one of the world's largest field experiments for mobilizing women. And it's not just an experiment, it's an experiment that's already paying dividends, right?
Yes, if I go back to 2012, I was a stay-at-home mom of five,
Well,
taking a break from a long career in corporate communications. And I was folding laundry, which, as you can imagine, is a full-time job with five kids. And I saw on my television there was breaking news of a mass shooting, an active shooter in Newtown, Connecticut. And like I'm sure you and so many other people in America, I just sort of stopped what I was doing for the next 12 hours and watched this horrific tragedy unfold.
mm,
And when I woke up, I just felt like, you know, I have to do something because I had watched many members of Congress do nothing after Columbine and the Virginia Tech shooting and the Gabby Giffords shooting. And I was a teen in the 1980s, very much impacted by Mothers Against Drunk Driving, was amazed by what these women accomplished,
right.
before social media in under a decade. And I thought we need that kind of group of women again to rise up against the most powerful, wealthy special interests that's ever existed.
Mm,
And so I created a Facebook page. I had 75 Facebook friends at the time. I was not a social
mm.
media phenom. And it was like lightning in a bottle. My 75 friends shared it with their friends who shared it with their friends. And suddenly I was getting DMs and I didn't imagine I'd be a public figure. So all of my information was out there. I was getting texts and calls and women mostly saying, how do I do this where I live?
Mm.
And I think in those early days, we thought this was rallying and organizing or rallying and marching. And what became clear, especially after legislation in Congress failed in the weeks and months after Sandy Hook, was that we would need to organize.
So many watched and didn't do something. And we all felt the outrage you felt, but you acted on those, on yours. Um, let's start with your beginning, your personal journey. Uh, how were you shaped, and what made you into the kind of person that did something when so many others did nothing?
I was raised in Rochester, New York, and that is a town where so many suffragists and civil rights activists made their mark, whether they lived there or passed through. And so when I was young, the field trips we took were to those places. We were taught that activists were heroes. And I really think that stuck with me. I ended up going into communications. And what that over a decade long career taught me was how to tell a story. Those were the skills that kicked in the day of the Sandy Hook school shooting. I was able to, in a pretty short amount of time, create a brand and a narrative that mostly moms, mostly women hooked into. Now, that was my main skill set. I was very lucky that complete strangers from across the country wanted to bring me their skill sets too, whether they were organizers or website developers or lawyers, all of them came to the table to help make this organization work. But in those early days, I do think I had a gut instinct that this was the right time, that this was going to happen, that my idea would actually come to fruition, but also that I could make us seem as credible and sophisticated and enticing as I could do that.
Hmm. You know, Time Magazine recently named you one of the 100 most influential people And I have the sense that you became influential because you didn't try to become influential. And it's a paradox. Is that a fair statement?
It is. I mean, I certainly don't think most people, growing up or even as a young adult would have looked at me and thought that I was a leader. I was diagnosed with pretty severe ADHD and a bunch of assorted related learning disabilities when I was 14. And I had a really hard time getting through middle school, high school, college, right? All of it by the skin of my teeth. And I just was constantly feeling like I did not fit into a system that was not made for the way that my brain worked. And so when the Sandy Hook school shooting happened, I don't think that anyone thought, at least the people who knew me, oh, this is the person that's going to rise to the occasion. And so I think that is the leadership ability in me, which is to say, you're telling me I can't or shouldn't do something, but I'm going to show you that I can, because the worst thing that happens is that I fail. And I don't really fear failure.
This is great insight into how you became the kind of person who could just rise up and take action and get a wave going. And we'll talk later about the wave. But today you started something, um, but there's a chapter in every state in America right now. I mean, this has become institutionalized, it's scaled. It went from something natural to you and organic into something quite scaled and institutionalized. So there are another set of skills and capabilities that you have created that this scale, this institutionalization. It's now enduring. It's part of the fabric of our country and society. How did you go to that next level?
Mhm. Well, as I mentioned, I was really inspired by Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And it just so happened that the day that I decided to start Moms Demand Action, I called the MAD hotline because I wanted to get advice from someone. And the CEO of MAD answered that hotline. And
Wow.
she ended up being someone who was a mentor to me to explain to me how they organized and how they created their brand. I eventually hired her and she helped lead Moms Demand Action for many years. But that was that was pivotal. I would say the other piece of it was having managed people in the corporate world. I worked at WellPoint and Bayer and General Electric and all these companies where my job was to help manage people in different states and countries to do the same thing, right? We were all communicators around the same products and company, but in different areas. And so when Moms Demand Action started, and Facebook was incredibly helpful in this because back in 2012, it's not necessarily this way today, but it was incredibly popular with middle-aged women. You would go there all the time, right? And so to go there to be an activist was sort of second nature.
If you were to reframe everything you just said in terms of a playbook for somebody else to grapple with and make their own of leadership, a playbook for movements, for taking an issue of consequence that matters, that they're passionate about, doing something about it at scale and impact. What would that playbook look like? What would the elements of that playbook be?
I think the first piece of it is you're going to have to build a plane as you fly it. I talk to a lot of people, and I think women in particular, who have this fear of failure, which is I have to cross every T and dot every I before I can get started. If that were the case, if I needed to know everything there was about gun violence, organizing the legislative process, which I knew nothing about in 2012, I still would not have started Moms Demand Action. I would still be collecting data and information. And I think sometimes that's an excuse for not getting it off the ground. You just kind of have to do it and understand that if you fail, you will learn how to figure it out the next time. I would say the other part of it is, managing volunteers, which is different than managing employees, can be a lot like herding cats. It requires a very different management style when people are not paid to report to you. I would say that when you're talking about leadership in the nonprofit world, there's a very delicate balance between top down and bottom up. If it's too top down, it's control. If it's too bottom up, it's chaos. So you're always trying to strike that balance, right? Of how do you have enough bottom up and enough top down so that everyone feels seen and heard and strategically on the same page. And I would also say that if your policy, if your organization, if it's not evolving, if it's very static to what it was when you began, you are failing. You will not succeed. And then finally, I would say, I'm interested in what you think about this. I think power is finite, and that from when you start something, you should be thinking about when you're going to leave that thing. Because, there's something called founder syndrome, this idea of your ego gets so wrapped up in something that if you leave, you want to burn it down or it can't succeed without you. And I made it a practice every year to ask myself, is this the year I leave? For 11 years. And finally, it was in 23 when I was standing in the Rose Garden and President Biden signed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act into law that I heard this voice inside me say, okay, this is it. This is the bookend to your activism. And I think the world would be a better place if we all thought, when am I going to hand over my power?
You joined us at the House Summit in December, where we explored, you mentioned the moral imperative. We explored the urgent need for moral leadership as an imperative in all sectors of society. And we emphasized that true leadership requires not just positions in society of formal authority, but that these positions are inhabited by individuals who lead with moral authority, moral leaders. You said then, and you've written, that leaders become truly powerful when they shift their mindset from power over people to power with them. And then you just said now that power is finite, and you said you're interested in what I think. So I'll just add one piece to that and then ask you a question. Historically, the sources of power used to be finite. If it was land, I went and got land so I could charge you rent to farm on my land. If it was capital, I acquired the capital so that I could charge you interest when I lent you some. And in this way, I could have power over you. But now the sources of power in an information age, a human age, are infinite. Ideas, communication, what you were able to do on Facebook. So if the source of power is no longer finite, but infinite, we have to find ways to manifest power in new ways, not over people because we can't, but through people and with people. And I think you're a shining example of power through people, a wave, a movement, and power with people, because you figured out that you can't have power over people. What was the source of your moral authority? That you were the person who could lead this and get it to the point where you could hand it off. And we'll talk about that. But what do you think made up the moral authority you had to, hold the flag, if you will?
Well, when I started Moms Demand Action, I did not mean to start an organization. I thought, oh, I'm going to go join something that already exists. There has to be a Mothers Against Drunk Driving already for this issue. So I went online and all I found were think tanks in Washington, D.C., run by men, and city and state organizations, again, mostly run by men. I wanted to be part of a badass army of women. Like I said, that's what I'd seen make change so many times throughout history. And I really think that the fact that I lived in the Midwest, I lived in Indiana, in a suburb outside of Indianapolis. I was a mother of 5, right? I think those things gave me credibility with the media. They couldn't believe that this woman in the Midwest was sort of standing up against the gun lobby. But the other thing I want to say, Dov, is, I was a white suburban mom who was afraid her kids weren't safe in their schools. Mm. And when you get involved in gun violence, what you quickly realize is that mass shootings and school shootings are about 1% of the gun violence in this country. And I had been ignoring the ongoing gun violence just 30 miles away from my home, right? Mm. And so I think it was also ultimately my willingness as a white mom to say, it can't just be about my kids in their school. We have to look at this issue holistically. We have to make sure that we are talking about the gun violence that kills over 120 people every single day, mostly with handguns and mostly in city centers.
From a leadership perspective, what did you learn about making progress, forging ahead, having the impact that you were committed to having, even though you were going up and down a lot? What did you learn from the ups, from the downs? What can you advise somebody else on an up and down journey to not quit it and not see the downs as a sign of it's time to stop because we've just dipped, but rather there's something to learn there, strength to be had there? What's your perspective on not just leading, but leading an up and down journey?
I love this question because you don't take on the largest, most powerful, wealthy special interest that's ever existed and expect you're going to win all the time. And so we came up with this concept called losing forward. And it's
Mm.
this idea of, yes, you're going to lose, and you may even lose a lot, but eventually you will win. I think it's Babe Ruth who said, you can't beat someone who never quits. So if we keep going, which many of our volunteers had tattooed on their bodies, the phrase keep going. If you keep going and you don't quit and you are thoughtful about what you learned, you will win the next time. And it's interesting because we asked our volunteers, it's not hard to get people to come into the organization. It is hard to get them to stay because they're volunteers. When we asked them, what is it that makes you stay? They said two things. The first was that they felt like they were winning. So we were constantly messaging. We celebrated every win, no matter how small, right? Because we want them to know that they're winning. We want them to feel like their time is being well used. They also said that they found their people.
Mm.
And so when you share values, when people depend on you, when you want to keep knowing those people, you show up, right? So understanding that it's a long game and that you're going to lose, but that's a way to win the next time. And then the other thing I would say is embracing incrementalism. Incrementalism is kind of a dirty word in activism, especially among younger activists. They want to get in, they want to make wholesale change, they want it to happen overnight, and damn it, if it doesn't, it's not worth doing. If that was the case, I would have stopped after the Manchin Toomey bill failed back in 2013 and got back to my normal life. But if you can see that the system is set up for these smaller steps forward and that it is incrementalism that leads to revolutions, then you understand that what you're doing is creating a foundation where you can win the next time.
And you've noted that continuing to engage people and inspire them in the rawest moments, in the middle of their outrage, that's usually easier than sustaining their engagement and inspiration in the passage of time. What have you learned about how, when you're playing such a long game, when these little things are supposed to add up to what you call a large revolution down the road, from a leadership perspective, how do you sustain it when you're away from the acute phases and the raw moments?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, unfortunately, in this country, there's no shortage of shooting tragedies. So it does always seem to be somewhat top of mind. But my job as the leader was really to rally the troops. I traveled the country probably 2 weeks out of every single month, right? To go visit different states and different cities, to thank them for their work, to listen to them and hear what concerns they had, to be activists on the ground with them. I think that's incredibly important. But we were also always had a mind on training our volunteers, recruiting volunteers for leadership. We learned pretty early on that if you were a chapter leader, that should only last for about 2 years. You start to create this power that you don't want to give up otherwise. And we wanted everyone to have a chance to be a leader in the organization. I think also because people felt like they found a group of people with their values, they wanted a paid position in the organization. So it's almost like Mary Kay, where you start out maybe as a data entry lead and you work your way up to chapter leader, and eventually maybe you're a paid organizer. And so it was just that we created a brand and a camaraderie that made women want to rise within the ranks.
But I should note, and I'm switching gears, that I'm having this conversation with you right now on the eve of a publication of your second book, right? Fired Up. And we talked about journeys, and Plutarch once said that only that which we achieve inwardly can affect outward reality. And this book, in many ways, is about the inner journey and how we go on an inner journey and find that spark and then translate it into outward impact. Is that a fair
Yes,
recitation of
yes, it's
what that does?
excellent.
So, and Elie Wiesel once said to me and said to others, I write not to be understood, but to understand.
Mm.
So as you're spending time beyond the original mission that you were on, and you're engaging others across topics, and you're trying to be helpful to others with respect to whatever their passions are, obviously constructive in the spirit of doing good in the world. Let's talk about the inner journey. What is this book about? Why did you write it? What did you work out in your own thinking? What are you here to offer others in terms of their hopes and aspirations? Just let's talk about Fired Up.
Yes, thank you. So, after I stepped back from Moms Demand Action, I thought, okay, I'm going to take a year off. I'm going to take a break. And I was running on a treadmill one night and I looked at my phone and I was getting a call from Maria Schreiber. And I didn't know Maria. So obviously I got off the treadmill and she said, I have a book in print and I'd like you to write a book. And I said, of course. I do not need a break. Who needs a break? I'll write a book for your imprint. And I said, well, what do you want it to be about? And she said, well, what have you learned? And I thought, well, wow, that's a big topic. How do I boil that down? And I think a big part of what I learned is that, we come up in a society where we are so encouraged to fulfill our obligations that we forget to follow our desires. We live from the outside in instead of the outside inside out. And it really wasn't until I was 41 years old that I figured that out for myself. That I figured out what I was good at and followed that. And using this metaphor of fire, if you're living on fire, which is how I refer to it, then it's really looking at two things. What is holding you back and what is calling you? And I don't think we spend enough time in our life doing that. The most common deathbed regret is that we didn't live a life that was authentic to us. And so I talked to 70 other people who had the same experiences and really wanted to talk about how do we go from following those obligations to finally becoming a fire starter, which is what I feel like I am. And I work with so many other people in my career and in my activism who are. And I hear so often from people, particularly women, that they think it's too late to do that. And it's not. It's never too late.
And I think the book is referred to as part manifesto, part roadmap.
Yes.
What's the manifesto in it, and what's the roadmap in it?
Well, it is to see this as a practice, to
Hmm.
continually ask yourself, what do I want? And to go after it. And that does, it can be personal, it can be political, it can be professional. I talk about how it helped, extricate me from a difficult marriage, an unhappy marriage, and a career that didn't fulfill me. And there's so many stories of others who have done the same. So the manifesto is that it's not too late, you're not too old. We hear a lot about the what, like all of the amazing things people are doing, particularly midlife. This is really about the how. And I would also say that if it's part of a practice, then there are exercises and there are different ways that people can figure out. First of all, how do they figure out what they want? How do they endure the blowback that comes with it? It's handling the blowback. It's getting through the messy middle, which is where I think a lot of people fall down because it gets hard, it gets tricky, gets difficult. So I interview a lot of people who got through that messy middle. Um, how do you do a controlled burn? Again, with a fire metaphor, but this idea of, there are these prescribed burns in nature that make way for beautiful things to grow and to prevent wildfires. I think there's an audit that we can do in our own lives too.
What do you recommend as the first or first and second thing somebody does to just get to be on fire, to
Yeah.
cross their Rubicon, to implicate themselves in action where they can't stop, they can't unring their own bell, so to speak? What how do you begin? How do you take that step, the kind of step that you took where there was no stopping, you were going to keep going?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's understanding the formula. So, do you know what your values, your abilities, and your desires are? Most of us don't. If you look at what are personal values, and Brene Brown is obviously an expert on this, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of values. And your values may change depending on what stage you are in your life. As a young mom, when I started Moms Demand Action, I had much different value priorities than I do now as an empty nester. And so the book will really walk you through a way to audit and figure out what are my values right now at this time in my life. Your abilities, those are innate or acquired. What abilities do you have that make you special, that you can bring to the table? And then it's asking yourself, what do I want? What are the things I haven't done? Maybe it's everything from a tough conversation or going to therapy or getting out of a relationship or starting. There's so many different things that you may have in your mind of what you want to do, but you haven't tried. And being honest with yourself about why you haven't.
Obviously, I've come to know you enough to know that this book is not about being an author or even a successful author, which you have been and will be a second time around. What is your mission today, your leadership mission today? It's not to sell books. The book
No,
was a way for you to sharpen your thinking, to complete your thinking, to put all your thoughts in one place, to be of benefit for others. But what is your mission now, and what do you envision your leadership journey to be now?
I would say something that I have realized from childhood, as I mentioned to you, the activists that I was taught to revere, to my activism with Moms Demand Action and beyond. What I'm ultimately passionate about is helping summon the audacity of women. That is
Mm.
something that just really fulfills me. I'm on the board of Emerge America. I help women decide to run for office and train them to do that. Women only hold about 25% of the elected positions in this country. There are 500,000 of them. And I think there's something to be said for being at the table, right? The saying goes, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu.
Mhm.
That's been the case. Um, I get asked a lot, will I run for office? I never say never. That's possibly in my future. We shall see. But I really am passionate about helping put women in positions of power.
So, one of the things we talk about a lot in our framework for moral leadership is that the hallmark of moral leadership is the pause. Where in the pause, we can reflect on the world, the situation we're encountering. We can reconnect with our conscience, our voice, our values. We can rethink the path and assumptions. And then and only then can we reimagine, better paths, better futures. You talk about how annually you pause and how frequently you pause. What matters is not how often you pause or when you pause, but what matters is what you do in the pause,
Mm.
how you interrogate yourself, the questions you ask yourself. Take us into your practice of the pause. Uh, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "In each pause, I hear the call." Take us into your pause or your pauses, the questions you ask yourself, how you interrogate yourself.
In my early 40s, I also became a practicing Buddhist.
Mm.
I was raised by a very strict Catholic father who had been in the seminary for 10 years. He
Mm.
came out when he was 23. And for me personally, it was not a tool set that helped me figure out how to live my life. It wasn't until I started understanding Buddhism that I was like, oh, this makes sense to me. And the pauses are built into Buddhism, literally, right? I meditate every single day. I find it to be very beneficial to not only clear my mind, but also to clarify all of the things that I'm working on and what I'm doing in my life. So I have a daily pause, of about 30 minutes that I find to be incredibly rejuvenating. But I would also say that a lot of that work that I do through Buddhism is about managing ego. And so the pauses for me are to be self-aware and to say, is this serving me or is this serving whatever it is that I'm focused on? And so that annual pause that you're talking about, I would ask myself at the beginning of every year, is this the time for you to go? But there's certainly other pauses, monthly, weekly, daily, where I ask myself, what do I want? It would be silly if I didn't ask myself because that's the tenet of my book. Am I doing what I want? Is it bringing me fulfillment? Am I doing it in a way that is helpful and not harmful to me and to
Mm.
others? That is really a practice.
Yeah. And the opposite of being ego based is also being truly humble. I mean, that
Mm.
meaning humble people don't think less of themselves, they think of themselves less. In many
I
ways,
love that saying. That's great.
we often talk that one aspect of leadership is not to be the hope. And you've demonstrated that you did not hold yourself out as the hope of this movement by, in many ways, transcending and leaving the movement. So, in many ways, a leader is not about being the hope, but inspiring hope in others. So, what about your roadmap and playbook gets at the how of inspiring hope in others?
I and our volunteers found is that by getting involved in gun safety activism, we didn't just transform an issue, we were transformed.
Mm,
We were transformed by coming together shoulder to shoulder with gun violence survivors and working on an issue that we knew we were on the right side of history on, making progress, celebrating our wins together. I mean, it was transformative. It was, as I said before, like touching the divine. And when you decide to do something like that, getting off the sidelines, whether it's professional, personal, or political, it will be transformative to you.
mm.
It will be something that impacts you. It's like a virtuous circle, right? When you figure out what makes you come alive, you want to help others come alive as well. And so I think that there is certainly hope in that. The other thing I would say is I got asked so many times in the 11 years I led Moms Demand Action, aren't you hopeless? Don't you feel like you're wasting your time working on a losing issue? And I just was shocked because, if you're in the weeds, you know that you're winning. We passed 500 gun
Right.
laws. We elected thousands of gun sense candidates to office. And I came to learn that cynicism
Mm,
is an excuse for inaction. It's
interesting.
easier to be cynical than it is to act. And there's an activist, Miriam Kambe, who says hope is a discipline. And a lot of what we've talked about is practice and discipline and
Yeah.
keeping at it and doing it over and over again. And I think you have to wake up and decide each day to be hopeful.
Well, we've never lived in a time where leadership is more consequential,
Yes.
where the decisions or actions or inactions of leaders reverberate and can get amplified so
Yes.
globally in an interdependent world. And that's why I choose to focus explicitly on leadership and different models of leadership. Activism is a context and the what, but these are all manifestations of leadership that we've been talking about, in my view. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be in conversation with you and to highlight you as an exquisite and quintessential example of inspirational leadership, of moral leadership, and moral leadership that really inspires others to be, I guess, to be fired up.
Well, coming from you, that is high praise, Dov. Thank you.